Now, we've been focusing both at the global and national level up till now, and I'd like it if you could bring us down to the micro scorecard of the Obama years. So taking it down to the family level, closer to home, are we closer to chaos or more secure on the home front? So if we could first look together at the issue, you've touched on it before, but if you could explicate a little bit further for us of personal privacy versus a surveillance state and how it affects the individual.
Well, I think psychologically, the fact that you're being watched or being surveilled tends to inhibit you. And that is part of the goal, is to discourage us from expressing what we think is going on, to complain. That's also behind the political correctness movement. You can't say anything bad about this or that person because somebody will be offended. And it's all about trying to trick us into rejecting our First Amendment rights to freedom of expression, freedom to peacefully assemble, freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, and make us think like it's all our own idea. The reality is that all this surveillance has not done a single thing about crime or terror. We proved over at our website that real criminals and terrorists can easily write encryption systems that the NSA cannot break. We did 6 of them over the course of a year. Not one of them was solved. So the NSA spying on all of us, the stingrays and the rest of it, it's not about finding crime and criminals. It's about making sure that the American people are not thinking those double plus ungood thoughts about Big Brother.
And I've even noticed in the last 2 years just a explosion of the amount of consumer electronics, consumer services, and other things that are all very nicely packaged in terms of convenience and control and making you the master of your life. There's home surveillance systems so you can cheerfully keep an eye on your pets and your babysitter while you're gone. There's where's my phone and where's my husband and wife's phone, and there's where's my the controls of my car to track that down, and cameras popping up in many locales on for red lights. They call them safety cameras, of course. And I read an announcement in the my wife told me about it in the news for a week before last that the city of Toledo in Ohio is adding cameras all over their city, and they won't even bother to as far as checkpoints, they won't even bother to stop you on the highway anymore. You'll just get your bill in the mail from the either the however surveillance technology noticed that you were going fast and identified your vehicle. So with this upswing of all these systems that are out there promising that they're for your convenience and to put more control into your hands. And never does it occur to anybody, it seems, that all of these things can be hacked, all these things can be used for ulterior motives, but they sure come off seeming that they're for your own good.
Oh, well, they're trying to convince you that they're all for your own good and benefit, but you're right, these are more systems of surveillance. I mean, every one of us is carrying around a tracking device that spies on us. It's called our cell phone. And the police can turn on the microphone in the cell phone without you knowing that it's on. I like computers, but I don't need one in my coffee pot. And I really think that we need to go back to a simpler, more elegant form of life in our homes. Now, the situation with all of these surveillance cameras just mailing you a bill goes on back to that comment about how local communities, counties they're in serious financial trouble. And what they're basically doing is they're pillaging their own population. They are literally going on out and stealing from the people to balance their budget. We know that civil forfeiture has become a major, major scandal in this country to the point where police departments are actually stealing more from the American people than the recognized crooks are doing. Our organized police forces are murdering more innocent Americans than the terrorists and the mass shooters put together. And people are starting to wonder, is the government itself become a criminal organization? And for a lot of people, the answer seems to be yes.
Now, taking it again to the family level on health care and personal health, we talked about sort of global and national, influences of GMOs and other things that affect health from contaminations. At the personal level, as far as open access to medicines, access to real, responsive, and personally appropriate care and care plans versus waiting or rationing and review panels. Are we better or worse off 8 years ago when it comes to health care and personal health options?
Well, we're much worse off than 8 years ago for a variety of reasons. One, a choice over our own medical care is being taken away from us, where they're passing all these laws saying you have to have all these vaccinations or you can't send your child to school, and it's something like 36, 37 mandatory vaccines, and these things are making these kids sick. They're causing permanent damage. But now they're talking about how you will not be allowed to have medical care under Obamacare unless your vaccinations are up to date, forcing you to accept these medications into your body, and you don't know what's in there. There's been a big stink recently about the discovery that there's an enzyme called negalase that is in pretty much all the vaccines being administered to people. And the problem is negalase destroys your own body's ability to fight off illness, including cancer. And so you're literally being injected with something to make you sick, which makes you a better customer for the medical industrial complex. We know that there have been several times when vaccine programs have been exposed for actually planting sterilization chemicals in women in the third world. And again, it's all about taking away our choice. The government is not treating us like we're human beings worthy of respect. We're being treated like we're livestock, like we're a herd. The government will decide for you what you will eat and what you're not allowed to eat. The GMO is a good example. They're talking about a law to ban GMO labeling. And obviously, if they knew GMOs were good, they would put that on the label quickly. Contains more GMO than this other product over here. So they're trying to take away your ability to choose whether you get healthy, clean water, what foods you eat, what foods you don't want to have, and certainly in the area of medicine, where we're being denied our ability to choose what medicines we want. Obamacare was actually set up to try and make more money for the health insurance industries who wrote the Affordable Care Act, and Obama went along with it because he was expecting a windfall of new tax revenues, which has not materialized. The Obamacare compliant policies, and I went through this myself, they're far more expensive than the earlier policies that Obama said we could keep, and that was a lie. And the deductibles are sky high. Most Americans will never actually use their Obamacare health insurance policies during a year because they won't meet that deductible, and yet they're ordered to buy these useless policies.
And when it comes to actually trying to receive care under those plans, I have a son who recently got a serious muscular sports injury and needed to see a specialist, but was told you can only see a specialist through referral. And his primary doctor, through his Obamacare insurance, said, yeah, we can get you in there in May. That's 4 months away before we can even see you to see whether we should refer you to a specialist or not. Ended up having to go into urgent care and paying it, more out of pocket, etc. So as far as access to care under Obamacare, I guess I'll ask you. We say more people are covered. Does that mean more people are getting the right care?
No. They're saying more people are covered because that's the political correct thing to say. But the coverage just really isn't there. And I had to go through that same situation with my wife of having to take her to urgent care over a situation because her regular system insurance physicians were not available and couldn't see it. And we paid something like $900. And here's the joke. We knew what was wrong with her. We walked into to the urgent care and we said, this is what she's got. This is the medicine she needs. One shot and will be $900. And it is, again, it's not about the health of the American people. It's about finding another way to take money away from you and give it to the money junkies and the government because they're all drowning in this artificial fiction of unpayable debt. And we need to start realizing that debt is an imaginary thing used to control us. It's its own form of government, ruled by debt slavery. Ruled by compound interest, whatever you want to call it. And it's no more legitimate a form of government than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And like those former failed systems, it only works if you allow yourself to be brainwashed into thinking this is the way the world is supposed to be. The good news is right now, more and more people are standing up and saying, no, this is not the way the world is supposed to be. We're not supposed to be living under absolute economic fascism. We're supposed to have a choice where we live, what we do. We should be able to work and enjoy the proceeds of our work rather than surrendering it to people who are insanely rich without having to work a day for it. And again, this idea that we're being told that we're not allowed a choice whether or not we're going to have chemicals in our food, whether or not we're going to have GMO in our food. You're not allowed to medicate yourself with stuff you can grow in your garden. You will go to the doctor and get a note. You will go to the drugstore and you will buy this stuff. And no, you don't need to know what's in it. And it's all about losing complete control over our personal lives. And if that doesn't tell you you're living in a dictatorship, nothing will.
Speaking of the right of people to stand up for themselves, if you would speak to us a little bit about the Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms and to purchase ammunition for those arms that you do own, can you tell us whether we're better or worse off than we were at the beginning of the Obama administration?
We're definitely much worse off. There's been an unrelenting campaign to convince us that we don't need guns and we can rely on the police, which is nonsense because the average wait time for a 911 call in the United States right now is running about 20 minutes. There was a story that came out of Los Angeles this last weekend of some hikers that were trapped in harsh weather up on Mount Baldy, and they called 911 something like 8 times, and it was 5 hours before anybody could get to them. And a lot can happen in 5 hours. A lot can happen in 20 minutes in your home when you're confronted with a violent criminal. And so the idea that we not have any guns, the only reason they want to take our guns away from us is because it preserves our right to say no. Because there is no freedom without the freedom to say no. And that's why the Founding Fathers put that amendment in there. It's not about target shooting. It's not about hunting. It's all about giving that central government a good reason to just leave people alone and mind its own business. But our government has reached the point where they can't perpetuate their wealth and power without having complete control over all of us. And in order to do that, they have to find a way to trick us out of our firearms. And we're seeing all of these mass shootings by people whose brains are melted on these antidepressants. Some of them appear to be complete staged frauds like Sandy Hook. But again, if you go back and study the history of COINTELPRO and all the frauds and deceptions that the government did back then that are confirmed to have happened, you understand this is how government controls you.
How about personal property rights versus eminent domain? People are often concerned that if they try to protect hearth and home and make sure that the integrity of their own land, their own property, their own homestead is going to be safe and secure and free from encroachment, that there will be some law that either on the books or that gets added or gets bypassed or whatever, everything could be taken away from them. Are we better or worse off than we were 8 years ago in terms of personal property rights versus eminent domain?
I think we're about the same. The difference is that more and more Americans are realizing that something very underhanded has been going on. What we saw up in Oregon or the Bundy Ranch are just two examples. There's a big stink down in Texas around the Red River. And you need to understand, again, this goes back to economics, because after Bretton Woods, these other nations agreed to go along with Bretton Woods on two conditions. One, that the U.S. would not overprint those dollars and just loot the rest of the world for ink and paper, and that the U.S. dollar would always be redeemable in gold for $35 an ounce. That was set in stone. Well, the Federal Reserve is not actually a part of the federal government. It's no more federal than Federal Express. And because it's a private bank, it did proceed in overprinting the dollar and using those dollars to get goods and services, products from other countries. So in the 1970s, France took a look in their vaults and they saw this huge stack of ink and paper, and they notified Richard Nixon they were going to cash these dollars in for gold at the agreed upon price of $35 per ounce. Richard Nixon took a look in Fort Knox, realized they had nowhere near enough gold to cover all those paper notes, and he ended gold convertibility. It was called the Nixon shock. Now, this had a couple of ramifications. Demand for the U.S. dollar began to fall, but more importantly, even back then, the U.S. government was borrowing money hand over fist from other countries and pledging the gold in Fort Knox as collateral. And all of a sudden, everybody realized, oh, there isn't that much gold in Fort Knox. They can't even cover the paper notes they've got. So Richard Nixon did something very, very sneaky. He formed the Environmental Protection Agency told us all we're here to protect the lands for future generations, and they started grabbing huge chunks of land and locking it away from the American people. And they did it so they could pledge these lands and their mineral resources as collateral on government borrowing. And they hid it under all these different programs, wilderness zones, wetlands, heritage rivers, and all these other little programs, so it didn't look like they were grabbing all that much. But at this point, the EPA and the Bureau of Land Management have grabbed about 25% of all the public land and sometimes private land in this country to pledge as collateral on government borrowing. And all of this is illegal because, again, under the Constitution, there's a provision called the Enclave Clause, which says the federal government may not own any land at all other than what is underneath federal buildings or federal infrastructure like military bases, harbors, and airports. And the Founding Fathers put that Enclave Clause in there specifically to prevent the central government from solving its self-created economic problems by plundering the heritage of the American people, our public and private lands. And again, that's what they're doing. And that's why these people were taking a stand up in Oregon or down at the Bundy Ranch. The Bureau of Land Management's grabbing of all this land is a violation of the Constitution. And these people are trying to stand up for their rights because they're talking about lands that their families have been on for generations. And all of a sudden, the Bureau of Land Management comes on in and says, well, we're going to take away this land because the desert tortoise is endangered. And then 6 months down the road, the Bureau of Land Management says, well, turns out we didn't really need this land anyway, and they put it up for private sale to developers. A lot of that been going on in Nevada.
So in addition to the federal government seizing both taking ownership and reselling of public and private lands, I just heard some, I do not remember the figure, some ghastly figure of residential real estate that is now owned by the Federal Reserve from sopping up all the insolvent mortgage-backed securities. So in addition to these lands, it's the houses of our country that are being grabbed.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the idea of the American dream of home ownership is going away. And the money junkies are really trying to take us back to the age of feudalism and serfdom, where the land owns the people rather than the people own the land. And this is a very deliberate policy. They want all the wealth in their pocket and all of humankind just working their entire lives away for permission to be on the land or the Lord's permission to go and do whatever. And it is anti-democratic. It's anti-republic. And again, getting back to the comment you were making about eminent domain. Eminent domain, when it was first established, was to be used only to seize private land that was needed for necessary government infrastructure, like a new highway or something like that. Recently, however, governments have started using eminent domain to take away land from somebody to give it to another party in the expectation it will generate a higher tax revenue. So you'll have somebody who owns this beautiful piece of land, free and clear. They're paying their property taxes, and the government will come in and say, well, we're going to take this land away and give it to a developer to put up a shopping mall because that'll create jobs and income and revenue and tax revenues. But that's not a legitimate use of eminent domain. If the real estate developer wants the land for a shopping mall, he should come in and make a proper offer to the owner. And if the owner refuses to sell, that's the owner's right. But that's now being overridden, where developers can go to the government and say, look, we want this bit of land out here. We're going to build a little shopping mall and a cloverleaf, and we're going to have all this stuff here. And the government says, yeah, we'll get more money out of that. And they take the land away from people. That was also part of what was going on out at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada.
Well, now, speaking about money in people's pockets, how about that? How about access to cash, being able to save up precious metals, doing all of this privately, without any risk of forfeiture or anything, and also being able just people have been concerned about the fragility of the bank, as you mentioned earlier. So they think, well, I'll become my own bank and I'll stock up and get any quantity of cash that I might need if things were to fall apart. Is that easier or harder to do now than it was 8 years ago?
It's for cash, it's easy. Whatever you've got, you can go to the bank and still get the cash for it. Silver and gold, huge demand for it right now, a lot of shortages. And we are hearing talk from Wall Street and Washington, D.C., that in order to take away from you your freedom to do with your own wealth as you will, they're literally proposing a cashless society where everything is done with a little plastic digital card. And what that really means is you don't have any of your own money in your pocket. It's in the bank, where they can charge negative interest rates on it, on your savings account, or they can, under the current law, they can grab it if they get into a financial mess. And they're taking away from you your freedom to do what you want with your money. This is a complete reversal of the original monetary system of the United States, in which the physical metal in the coin was the money. And once it was in your pocket, you could do what you wanted with it. There was nothing the government or the banks could do to play with the value of it. And now we've gone the complete reverse, where the banks and the financial systems will have all of the money, and you will just move it from one bank to the other with this little bit of plastic. And in order to make this work, okay, they're going to have to ban private ownership of any commodity that can hold value, whether it's silver, gold, platinum, tantalum, and there's been talk about that. And remember, back in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt did ban private ownership of investment metal, because they had to take away all the wealth of the American people and they had to give it to those poor, struggling banks, because in the United States of America, banks are much more important than human beings. The banks are precious. They're, we've got to take care of them. Humans, we've got too many of them anyway. And so ultimately, any government that gets in trouble, their first move is, we're going to take away the wealth of the people and give it to the banks and hope that's going to work out. In our current situation, no, it's at best a stalling action ahead of the final collapse. And what the American people need to do right now is make a choice. The government is too deep in debt to ever get out. Are we going to allow ourselves to be sucked down to absolute poverty with them? Or are we going to cut our losses, stop throwing good money after bad into this black hole of debt in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, and just preserve what we've got left? And most people are taking that position. We got to preserve what we've got left. Like I said, physical silver and gold, a lot of people are buying it. If you buy it in small amounts, there's no record. If you're placing large purchases of gold, they have been keeping records for some years now, so they know whose door to knock on.
And I would caution folks, if you had mentioned you can get your cash out, but there are transaction limits that if you exceed those, you will raise a lot of attention, have to sign extra forms, and it gets sent in for federal reporting and so on. So if you do want to accumulate a stockpile of cash, you're best off doing it in 1,000 or 2 or 3 at a time rather than more than that.
Little tiny bits here, and even more and more. I'm getting emails from people saying that I went to the bank to get so many $1,000s to buy a private party car with, and the teller said, no, you don't want to take that cash. Use a check, use this. We're seeing already in Europe where large cash withdrawals are just absolutely being banned. If you are doing a transaction over a certain amount, it must be done by paper check so that there is a record for the government to look at. That's how scared they are of all of you, that they want this total surveillance on everything that you do. Those little supermarket shopping discount cards that you get? First of all, there is no discount with them. Okay, they'll charge you more if you don't have a card, but there's no real discount. They're still making money off of you. Those cards are there so the government knows what you're buying at the supermarket, to make sure that you are not buying too much of certain chemicals that could be used to cause mayhem. And that's really what it is. They're tracking everything that you do with those cards, which is why we should all just swap cards, muck up the system that way.
So on the topic of stockpiling, what about stockpiling food and supplies? We have heard, and don't know if it's just exaggeration or not, that people who are really interested in preparedness and who really do a great job of many months or even years of non-perishable food storage and that sort of thing may find themselves subject to that being seized in times of if things go into chaos situations or whatever. Can you help shed any light on whether we're better or worse off as far as privacy and individual freedom of choice as far as stockpiling than we were 8 years ago?
We're worse off because we're already hearing talk about anti-hoarding laws. How dare you have all this food that you bought and saved up and you're not sharing it with your hardworking government. And as you know, prepping isn't something that you do once and forget about it. Prepping is a lifestyle. But again, just like with the buying of the silver and gold or withdrawing cash from the bank or buying ammunition, a little bit at a time on a constant basis, you don't want anybody to know that you have prepped. Simply because when things get really bad, I'm sure the government will be issuing, reward offers. Do you know somebody with a stockpile of food we can take and send to the soldiers in the field and so forth? Things are very, very gritty out there. And ultimately, again, government becomes a predator on its own people in order to ensure its own survival. It's an ugly situation here. I mean, what I really foresee happening in the immediate future is there's going to be a major financial crash. Now, our government is desperate to start a real bloody war with Russia, so they got something to blame on it. Don't blame us for the economic meltdown. It's those evil Russians, they did it. Because that's what worked the last two times. Every time the U.S. government gets itself into a financial corner, they get into a bloody world war to get out of it. Crash of 1907, World War I. Crash of 1929, World War II. Crash of 2008. Look how many countries the U.S. government is attacking. Okay? But what I really see as the most likely outcome of what we're living through right now is there's going to be a major economic crash. And by the way, the Asian markets just opened. They're taking another clubbing over there. They got to be feeling like baby seals about now. There's going to be an economic crash. It's going to take the federal government down with it because people don't believe the federal government is working for them anymore. It's going to be a repeat of what happened over in Russia when the Soviet Union fell apart. And there was very little bloodshed, fortunately. And there's going to be about 4, 5, 6 months of real hardship where we're going to have to be looking out for our friends and our neighbors and taking care of each other because there won't be anybody else to do it. And then we're going to form a whole new nation in this land, and things are going to be a lot better for us, just like life today in the Russian republics is much, much improved over what it was under the Soviet Union. And that is really the outcome I see happening. I do not recommend any kind of an armed revolution against the U.S. government because if there is one thing the U.S. government is really good at, it's killing people.
Now, a lot of what you've talked about is physical in nature. What about the mental aspect? You just mentioned about people rising up intellectually or through some kind of unity of thought to form a better system, a better government. But what about the preparation of our young people through, for example, freedom of different types of education, homeschooling, opting out of a federally regulated system? Are we better or worse off than we were 8 years ago in terms of the freedom of thought and the freedom to educate our own children?
Again, we're much worse off because even within the formal education system, Common Core is creating a generation of people taught to obey. They're being taught ways of solving problems that are deliberately obfuscated in order to not allow them to grow up to be clear thinkers and analyzers. Universities, which when I was a kid were where you went to start exploring new ideas, have become very rigid enforcers of the status quo. The political correctness movement, Israel's infiltration of our college campuses to keep pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian propaganda going. It is very, very rigid out there. We are seeing stories where people in the United States who are trying to homeschool are now being arrested and thrown in prison and their children taken away. From the government's point of view, parents don't own their children anymore. The children are the property of the state, and once you take a step across that line, anything the government wants to do with the children is perfectly acceptable, including forcing 37, 38 vaccines on them, even though they may not actually be working. And I don't know about homeschooling. I do think, especially for those people who aren't able to find work, that when your child comes home from their regular indoctrination at the state-controlled schools, that you make a point of sitting down with them and talking over what they learned and challenging some of what they're being told that isn't, in fact, accurate. And you need to give a message to your children, look, schools are there to make you useful to the state. Go to school, learn the lessons there, tell the teacher what the teacher wants to hear, but always in your own mind be a free and independent spirit. That's probably the most optimal course here right now because we're seeing children who'll go into their classes and they'll call the teachers out on mistakes that the teachers have made, and the children are being punished. And the attitude of the school administration it's not a question of right or wrong. This child will not do what they're being told to do. And that's really what modern education has come down to. And Common Core is a disaster. It is hideously corrupt. I have a friend who used to work for one of the companies at the heart of Common Core, and the stories they were telling about, double billing the educational system, that Common Core was designed to force schools to buy all new textbooks year after year after year after year, just like we're being taught to, buy new things over and over and over again because that's how they make their money. But it's, again, just like the health industry is not about health, the education industry is not about industry. It's all about money. And anytime you get into privatization, that's what it's about. They're not concerned with the original mission. They're concerned with making a fast buck.
Well, you mentioned the spirit as well, and for people's freedom and their personal freedom of belief, of faith, of worship, of acting out on their beliefs and on their faith in the world, versus being mandated by the government of what's being defined, what is permissible to believe, being mandated by the government on what you have to support, whether it goes against your conscience or not. Are we better or worse off than we were at the beginning of the Obama administration for religious freedom of conscience?
That is a very, very difficult question because we're getting a lot of mixed messages. I think we still live in a land where you can worship whatever religion you want to follow, or if you are a person without religion, which is now a significant part of the population, you can do that too and find something else to do on your Sunday mornings. There seems to be a lot of cross purposes regarding your faith being practiced in the real world. Now, with regard to private institutions like doctors and hospitals, it's a very complicated issue, but it is a founding principle of the United States of America that there is a separation between church and state, that you are not supposed to impose your religious views on any function of government. And that is causing a lot of concern. What is really alarming is even though we decry the theocracies of the Middle East as being obviously bad, there seem to be a lot of Christians in this country who are perfectly okay with establishing a Christian theocracy in the United States of America. And to me, that is a very dangerous double standard or hypocrisy. I think people should be free to worship however they want, as long as they're not causing harm to other people. But there's a reason that you have churches, and that's where you go to exercise your religion. You shouldn't have your religion in the schools imposed on people or in any office of the government. And that is a founding principle that I'm very much in agreement with.
So we might differ on some aspects of that one, because I've definitely heard critiques of the so-called doctrine of separation of church and state, saying that what the Constitution explicitly calls out is the government not being able to diminish people's rights for free exercise of their religion. So rather than necessarily the other way around, certainly understand the idea of imposing theocracies it can be trespassing on other people's rights. And I think we certainly align on the idea about not causing harm to others through, and then being able to justify that, by claiming you're justified by faith. But I guess I would definitely think that in the last administration, we've seen numerous examples of the government setting itself up and to be the judge and jury of what either constitutes sufficient religiosity or faith to be able to receive exceptions from rules and edicts that have come from the government that said they go against people's conscience. They're about forcing them to do things that are against their conscience.
Well, let's go all the way back to the source of all of this, and that, of course, is the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no laws respecting an institution of religion. That gets misquoted a lot. A lot of people go around and say Congress will make no laws regarding an institution of religion. No, it's not regarding, it's respecting. The goal there was to prevent any one religion from having civil authority over the rest. And this came out of not only the wars between the Protestants and Catholics that almost destroyed Britain, it came out of a lot of very terrible things that happened in the American colonies, based on governments that said we are of this religion and no other. And so basically, as Thomas Jefferson said, this wall of separation between church and state is you live your religion in your own personal life and in your church. But when it comes to any function within the government itself, okay, the government may not show deference to any one religious point of view over any other. That's really what it comes down to. And I think that's a very good idea, because history has shown when any one religion gains civil authority, the first thing it does is go after all the other religions.
So if we were to wrap this all up in a summary, both from the macro to the micro level, the main theme I've noticed you pointing out is a couple. One is the inherent toxic nature of the debt-based economic system that eventually makes feudal serfs out of everyone, and also that the the period it seems that you're pointing out that we've reached in that the development of that in the current cycle is one of near crisis, where both at globally, nationally, and state and local levels, the governments are in such serious debt that there's grasping and stealing going on from the common person, both from their property, their wealth through taxation and so on. And also, you've mentioned quite a bit about the increase in dictator-like control over people's their actions, what they're allowed to eat, drink, selling them their own water, selling them their own food, etc. So that's what I'm taking from your major themes, and I don't think there was any of our scorecard where you pointed out us we're in better shape than we were. Can you leave us with any bright spots on the horizon? Is there anything you can think of in our how it affects preparedness and family rights, where we're better off than we were 8 years ago, or is it as serious as it seems? And if it is, what are like one or two things that you think people should specifically do about it?
Yeah, we are at a crisis point. I mean, we're literally in a race between the collapse of the U.S. economic system and government, or them succeeding in starting a global war on which to blame everything on. And we don't know how that's going to work out. Prepping is obviously something done at the individual private level, and there are still lots of resources out there. What the most important thing to do is to start developing an independent mental attitude. Government controls us by forcing us to be dependent on them. You will be dependent on the city water supply of Flint. You will be dependent on the electrical utility that's coming in. I mean, we've seen a lot of stories where off-the-grid houses with solar cells and wind are built, and then they're hit with a demolition order unless they go back and hook into the city water and city power, because you're not allowed to be independent. Dependency is a form of enslavement. And that's why back in 1776, when the Founding Fathers kicked out the British, they didn't call it Freedom Day. They didn't call it Revolution Day. They didn't call it We Kicked the British Butt Day. They called it Independence Day, because that's when they stopped being dependent on Britain. And that was how King George III, ruled the colonies. They were forced to be dependent on banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. They were forced to buy all of their goods from the British East India Company. They were forced to buy cloth from the knitting mills of Manchester and Leeds. They were not allowed to decide for themselves how they would conduct their business. And we're back in an identical situation today. You will buy your food from the GMO companies. You will get your medicine from big pharmaceuticals. We've lost our independence, and it's a mental trap. And I think everybody needs to start thinking about being independent and just saying, I refuse to be made dependent on all of these corporations and government. And once you make that mental switch, the instinct to be a prepper will direct you. And you'll find out it's actually easier. Like I said, it's not something that you do once where you buy a bunch of food and store it in the garage and then forget about it. Prepping is a constant, ongoing lifestyle. And you think about prepping every day. You think about independence every day. How would I deal with it if this was no longer available? And all of a sudden you begin to understand just what it is you need to be doing.
Well, Mike, I'm really glad you were here with us. I think you've given us just so much food for thought. It's just a rich experience whenever we get a chance to talk with you. Just really appreciate you joining us here on Reluctant Preppers, and I'm sure our audience feels the same. So just thanks for taking the time. And if they want to find out more of your work, where can they find you? Okay, the website is whatreallyhappened.com. And I also host a talk radio show at the Genesis Communication Network from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Central U.S. time. And you can pick that up either at my website or at gcnlive.com. So Mike Rivero, founder and host of whatreallyhappened.com. Thanks so much for being here on Reluctant Preppers. Thank you for having me.